No, we've been live for 10 seconds. That's awkward. Hello and welcome to the second episode of the AL.com Alabama Recruiting Show. I am Nick Alvarez, a recruiting reporter and quasi-Alabama beat writer for AL.com. Behind the scenes, we have the great Patrick Greenfield as our social media and video producer. Before we get going, I want to give a shout out to Inline Lighting and Electrical. Thank you so much for the support in the show. If you guys have any electrical or lighting needs, be sure to check them out. This week, we are going to be looking at two things with terms of Alabama football recruiting, the quarterbacks that are currently in the class, and we'll talk a little bit about Alabama's recruiting in Texas, considering the big game this weekend. But to start, for quarterbacks, during the Utah State game, Alabama fans got a little bit of a look at the future of Crimson Tide under center. You saw Jalen Milroe get some snaps, saw 2022 five-star Ty Simpson get some snaps, but, it's Alabama, so there's always going to be an element of what's next. And for Tide fans, there's some pretty exciting news in terms of what's coming down the pipeline, because Alabama has two quarterbacks currently rated in the 247 consensus top 10 in Dylan Lonergan and Eli Holstein. Dylan Lonergan from Brookwood, Georgia, Holstein from Zachary in Louisiana. So obviously going into the year, the conversation regarding the quarterback position for Alabama was, is Arch Manning coming? That quickly soon pivoted to Eli, who actually committed a few days after Arch scheduled his official visit for Alabama. And then Dylan Lonergan, a little bit more of an interesting case, being a two-sport athlete and also a baseball player, which we'll get into in a little bit. But he also added on in the class. So Alabama has two quarterbacks, which when you kind of look at the way they've gone the last few years, will be the same number of players in the actual room come next fall. If you look at this historic run, I guess the Tide are on between Tua Tagovailoa to Jalen Hurts to Mac Jones to now to Bryce Young, there's an expectation that you're coming in and you can wait a year. And I think that's something from talking to Dylan and Eli's coaches and parents, that's something kind of they believe in, that there isn't necessarily a competition between those two coming in, because at Alabama, you're competing with the other, past 4 and 5 stars on the depth chart. But to kind of highlight one to start, let's look at Dylan Lonergan. We have some highlights from Brookwood's last game this past weekend. Not the best start for Brookwood. They're 1-2, but from a quarterback standpoint, Dylan Lonergan really kind of can bring it all to the table. He has a very strong arm. He is athletic. He ran for 500 yards last year. I think he's ran for about 160 through his first 2 games this year. He is someone who can really come forward and show you everything you want. I watch his highlights, and I don't think he's necessarily as athletic as Eli Holstein, but he is someone who is not afraid to push the ball downfield without necessarily being risky with the ball. I think he only had 2 or 3 interceptions last year, and his offensive coordinator, blamed them on himself, saying that there was an issue with the play call. One of those interceptions was from the number 1 overall prospect in 2022 in Travis Hunter in Collins Hill in Georgia. Dylan comes from a legacy of quarterback and two-sport athletes. His dad, Dan Lonergan, backed up Todd Blackledge for Penn State's 1982 national championship team. And going out of school, he played 2 sports. Growing up, Dylan played 4 sports: football, basketball, baseball, and golf. Slowly started dropping the other ones, and now he's a 2-sport athlete. He can touch 90 miles per hour on the mound with his fastball. He trained in the summer, and his travel baseball team in the summer is with kind of an auxiliary scout for the New York Mets. I know that before he committed to Alabama and before he took some visits this past summer, he actually had a workout with an MLB team. I had a story on AL.com a couple months ago when I talked to Dylan's quarterback coach, and he said if I was an Alabama fan, I wouldn't be afraid of him navigating both baseball and football. I would be worried that an MLB team might draft him and he'll get tempted with the millions of dollars and the slightly more long-term future of an MLB career. But in terms of a quarterback prospect, he is not going to be enrolling early like most Alabama recruits do. He is fully planning on playing his spring season with Brookwood and his baseball team. And he's someone that's, when you ask him, what's your favorite sport or which one do you prefer? He say, whichever one is in season. He's someone that really is going to be more of a quiet leader. And he's going to approach the game as, hey, follow me and watch what I do. See some people coming into the chat. If you have any questions, we'll try to get to them at the end. Feel free to drop them in below or comment or email us or email me at nalvarez@al.com. Or, like I said, drop them in the chat. And pivoting to Eli a little bit, kind of a similar type of quarterback. He helped Zachary win a state championship last year in the Superdome. He similarly is very smart with the ball. One thing I always think about when I think about Eli's profile is one of his coaches said you can count on one hand the number of bad passes he's made the last few years in Louisiana. When you think of Louisiana quarterbacks, Arch Manning comes to mind, but Arch Manning plays in a lower classification. So just from a competitive standpoint, Eli, I think, is getting a little bit more exposure to what he could possibly see in the SEC. I also think it's worth noting what I mentioned earlier. He committed to Alabama a couple days after Arch had announced his visit. Not that there's any kind of underhanded thing going on, but he's a kid who understands the point of that competition, and I think will approach it, head on, regardless of who will be competing for his starting job with. There is a photo that went out a couple weeks ago, or about a month ago, for Alabama's scrimmage of Ty Simpson kind of in midair throwing this perfect pass. I kind of see that a lot with Eli Holstein. I think he's someone who's not afraid to run a little bit, not afraid to really just push the ball downfield also, but trust his arm in the process. Right now, through his first game, he had 231 yards passing, 3 touchdowns. He's someone that coaches love his work ethic. He's another kind of silent type leader, but I think we've seen at Alabama in the past, you don't need to kind of be the rah-rah guy to really get people going. It's you come in, you do your work, and let that kind of speak for you. For Eli, I think where he needs to grow a little bit, I talked to some defensive coordinators and coaches who have schemed against him the past few years, and they said you always want to speed up Eli a little bit. He likes to process it, he likes to know where he's going with the ball, but if you can rush him just a little bit, you might get him thinking he sees one thing when you actually can drop back into coverage or threaten a blitz and then drop into a zone and try to catch him sleeping a little bit. But again, that's a minor critique from a high school coach who just barely beat him in Zachary last year. So in terms of the future, I don't see Alabama getting a third quarterback in the class. I guess there is a potential that one of them could transfer. Dylan, in his press conference where he committed, said, "I'm committing to play both baseball and football." It's very important for him that he gets the opportunity to do both. If you look at the other schools on his list, he didn't consider Georgia because he wouldn't play baseball there. He heavily considered Stanford because of the prestige that both their baseball and football programs have. So, if he gets to Tuscaloosa next summer and, you can't play baseball, well, I think he won't say, "Oh, fine, I won't be at Tuscaloosa." And then for Eli, I've heard from other people that Alabama internally, at least coming in, views Dylan as kind of higher ranked on their board. I think you can kind of maybe justify that, seeing that they did heavily recruit him after they got Eli's commitment and really kept pushing for a quarterback that some people thought they were out of the mix for in Dylan. But in that case, there's some other teams right now in 2023 that don't have a quarterback that would be remiss not to call one or the other and say, hey, if you think you're not getting the full opportunity there, it's a pitch that many Alabama targets have heard in the past. Hey, why don't you come over here and get an opportunity? Pivoting to this week's big game a little bit, Alabama is back in Texas. Can't even remember the last time they played in Austin. The last time they played the Longhorns in general was for the Rose Bowl national championship game about 12 years ago. So this past week at the Alabama press conference, I asked Saban a little bit about kind of the recruiting strategy in Texas, and we have a clip if we want to get that rolling.
Recruiting standpoint, obviously you guys have spent time in College Station, but what are some of the advantages and the opportunities to now play a game in Austin in front of that community and that fan base from a recruiting standpoint?
I think that anytime you get exposure in an area, it obviously helps, recruiting. So it doesn't matter where you play, whether we play in Atlanta or whether we play somewhere in Texas. I think that exposure makes, people in that area more aware of your program, who you are, players on your team. So I do think those things have an impact in recruiting. And it's a great opportunity for us to have a chance to play a school like Texas, who's got great tradition, and they got a really good team.
So yeah, tying back, the last time Alabama actually played in Austin was in 1922. Shout out to Patrick for the help there. And if you look at some of the the more recent targets that Alabama has gotten from Texas, Jalen Milroe, Jalen Waddle a couple years prior. If you look at the 2023 board, Alabama has 0 recruits from Texas, but they still have 21 total commits and the number 1 overall class. Coincidentally, the Longhorns with Coach Sark are number 2 right now. If you want to look at some targets that the teams will be competing for in kind of the coming months, look at Jalen Hale, who's a really, really strong wide receiver. He's currently crystal balled to Texas. Deuce Robinson is one of the best tight ends in the country. That might come down to the Crimson Tide and the Longhorns. The Crimson Tide may have an edge there. And then kind of, one of the remaining 5 stars that have yet to decide is defensive lineman David Hicks, who's currently predicted to the Sooners, but, he'll be drawing attention from national programs until he decides. And if you want to look at where Alabama's lacking in the class currently, you would see defensive line as an area of need. So that's a name just to keep monitoring as, the James Smith and the Quay Roussells of the world figure themselves out. Now, before we wrap it up here, I just want to kind of scroll through the chat, see if we're missing any questions. And I think we're good. So Alabama plays Texas this week at 11 a.m. Central Time. It's the big noon kickoff. It's the biggest game of the early season for either team and part of the college football world so far. And there's going to be a lot of recruits there. There's going to be a lot of interest in the game. And like Coach Saban said, anytime Alabama comes into town, it's a bit of a show. And I'm sure, the recruits will get to see that. So thank you guys so much for coming to check us out. Again, I want to plug our sponsor, Inline Lighting. And if you have any questions between now and next week, be sure to send them over from Patrick and myself. Thanks for listening.